good morning, good afternoon for attendees. So today is about medical device design control, and it's my great pleasure to actually welcome today is Larry Sampson. Has very much accomplished 20 years of medical device experience, currently Chief Operating Officer at Swan Valley Medical, and has a vast knowledge of expertise in software and obviously as well as in medical device development. Excellent. Since this is a Polarian-sponsored webinar, I would like to start with a little bit of an introduction about who we are. Polarian is obviously a software manufacturer, and we're globally based. We're about 10 years old. We have a completely web-based what's called an application lifecycle management, or ALM, solution. And what that means in a nutshell, if you look at this slide that's up right now, is that we have a solution that manages all of the various development processes to developing software. So starting from the inception of creating your requirements for your medical device, testing the quality control, managing all the defects, and so on and so forth, all the way to production level quality. And of course, one of the goodies from a regulatory perspective is pulling out all of the audits and matrix for full traceability to hopefully accelerate your FDA compliance. Just very quickly, as I mentioned, we're a globalized company, but we've also got some great recognition from the industries, in particular from various well-known analysts such as the Gartner organization. One of the key strengths that they talk about for us is the fact that we are a visionary and that we have a very strong platform tool set. One of the key things that, if you're not aware of our products, and I do encourage afterwards to take a look at them, is the fact that it, as I mentioned, is 100% web-based, but we also are based on open source. We use Subversion as our back-end repository, what really, the reason why I mention that is that it allows you as a producer of medical devices solutions is to have complete traceability from the time you create your requirements all the way to your source control, which auditors obviously like, and will make your life a lot easier. So having said that, I will now pass over the reins over to Larry Sampson. Thank you very much. Welcome, Larry.
Thank you. Appreciate you all coming today to have a discussion about this. This is a topic that it's a little difficult to approach because when we do medical device design control, of course, there's lots of different ways to do things. So part of this is, what is a format that works for medical device, but also working inside of Polarian, what are some of the different things you need to consider when you're creating a project of this type so that you don't end up with things you need to wish you'd thought about at the beginning of the project at the end. So in part, this is going to be a discussion just about when we set up a project, what are the things we think about, and different things to consider, and also provide you with some templates as to a good place to start that I've found in the work that I've done. And I've implemented a great variety of these up to this point. So I have a pretty good sense of how to set the project up. So hopefully this is some guidance that's helpful to you. So just as Reg was talking a few minutes ago, just wanted to give you a slide of my background. As you said, I'm a Chief Operating Officer for Swan Valley Medical, about 20 years experience. And what we do is a couple different things. We design and develop medical devices for the urological surgical instrument space. And also we do consulting work to help people with medical device systems. So, and our tagline is we bring predictability. So our attempt here is to provide systems for medical device firms. So let's just dive right in. So what is a concept management tool? Concept management system is a system that breaks language up into logical artifacts and interrelates these artifacts with one another. So most document management systems are designed to control and handle the documents as a whole. but a concept management system breaks the document down into its logical components and then takes those logical components and links them together in order to provide a logic traceability between the different document components. Plarion accomplishes this, with a system that defines the logical artifact with a flexible kind of work item concept, and the work item can be clearly defined as basically any logical idea. So it's basically a logic container, for lack of a different term. Examples of work items, and you're going to recognize most of the terms, are functional requirements, test plans, hazardous situation, or a defect. These work items are then interrelated with logic, relationship logic. So examples of relationship logic might include, in our space, verified or validated or causes, or perhaps refined. So examples, a hazard causes a harm, a requirement refines a user need, or a test case verifies a product requirement. So what we're trying to do here is provide these logical ideas and interrelate them. So that's fine, right? But why is it useful? What do we use this tool for? Well, it's useful because in a typical project, there are multiple logical arguments made, and each of these arguments has to be tracked and arranged in order to make sure the project's complete, and they need their own traceability to examples that are the design proof to assure that the design's been verified and validated, but another one is the risk management piece where we're tracking the requirements against hazardous situations to be sure that all the mitigations are in place. So we have these various different arguments, and we're interrelating the different ideas to try and provide a logical argument for each of the different aspects of the project. So hopefully this whets your appetite to take a look at how to set up a typical medical device project. I typically break up the initial discussion into a number of general topics. The first is a discussion to define the construction of the project logic. And so this is typically communicated in a comprehensive traceability table. Later we'll discuss a template you could use as a starting point for your implementation if you like. At least it gives you a starting point so you can discuss it internally. Second, and maybe more difficult, is a discussion about the unique project and how the documentation will be created and maintained. So I typically discuss the document architecture, and there are a variety of ways to organize the documentation. So you can do it as a system and subcomponents, or sometimes people functionally organize them. What requirement documents feed into what system level, that kind of thing. In this phase, we also discuss the regulatory requirements of the project. Every medical project has certain required components, and the company will need to decide what component goes where in the document set. So for example, every project will require a project plan, a risk management plan, a risk management analysis, and a risk management report, and input definition, just to name a few. But also each product has its unique set of requirements because the device is inherently different. And so, for example, some have software and some don't. And oftentimes, particular devices, of course, have their own regulatory documents that are associated with them. Just one example of that, and just because it's on my mind, I did a transcatheter heart valve, and the ISO 58, I think it was 5840, is the transcatheter heart valve standard that we have to be compliant with to get that device into the field. So there's all kinds of requirements, sources, and different aspects of the design that you need to consider when you're putting together the project stack. And then the last thing is issues associated with other requirements. So we have external systems interfaces, potentially software validation, project deliverables. So do we want to build this to a submission or not? So these are the things that we want to consider. So the first thing, or two of the most important logical breakdowns in the thing, are the comprehensive traceability table and the risk management or analysis construction. So each of these are critical to get it right before the project started. The definitions can be changed after the project started, but there's quite a bit of engineering work that goes into the marking of the design elements and the interrelating of them, and change later will drive some additional and unnecessary work. So it's better to get these nailed down early. So we probably ought to talk about those right now. So comprehensive traceability. This is essentially the overall flow chart for how we interrelate all these different elements in the design stack. So this is a logical argument, and what it is used for is just a template so that when people are working inside the project and they want to understand how one thing relates to the other, it's all in one spot. So it's broken down into three major categories: the design proof, the manufacturing flow, and then the risk analysis. The design proof consists of 4 elements in general. There's more there, but and they're shown in green here. So the user need, the product requirement, and the design output and then of course the test cases that either verify or validate the user need. So the user need is defined as a design input, which is tied out with a validation test. And these are often generally defined inputs which need engineering evaluation to refine the need into a tactical plan for the design work. The product requirements are defined as design inputs with an additional requirement that they include basically test criteria, so acceptance criteria, I should say. So what we want in a requirement is not only to say what the design should do, but what good means. We want to have that acceptance criteria as part of the requirement, whereas the user need could be more general. You know, we want the surgeon to think the handpiece feels good. Well, that's a matter of validation. We'll give it to a surgeon and ask them their opinion, but from an engineering standpoint, we need more resolution. So, you know, what standards are we going to apply? How big should the device be? This kind of thing. So the FDA's example of the distinction between these two types of input is the construction of a building. And the user need, for example, is the building, and they, you know, we would say that the user needs to be comfortably warm in the building. So that would be the input that's considered the user need. Then there would be requirements that the HVAC would supply a certain amount of airflow and temperature range. So our engineering requirements would specify what that would be. And then the system would be constructed and each of the design requirements would be verified. But once the system's complete and the requirements checked, we need to add an additional test to the user for the user requirement. And what we do is we bring users into the building, and then we'd ask them if the building is comfortable. So whatever that means, right? So our engineering staff has interpreted what it means with the requirements, but in the end, we need to stop, back up, and come back and check whether we actually got to the place where that user need was met. So essentially that's the design piece, or the traceability. The user needs, one of the reasons to separate these two work items is the user needs are validated, and we want to specifically have a list of validation tests that we want, and then the requirements are verified. So in our procedures for listing out these two different things, they're in two different lists, and we have different tests to tie each one out. And then, of course, the output satisfies the design requirement, and that output is our specifications, essentially. So what we have with the specifications is a list of both the product prints and parts that are used to build the product, but also code, work instructions for fabrication of the product, you know, inspection steps, all that. So really what this output list ends up being is your DMR. So we want our device master record, or the recipe for the product, to be tied into our requirements, so that if we have a problem with those, we have immediate tie out into the requirements and user needs that are being satisfied by that part. Then, of course, the second piece is the manufacturing piece. And so what we have is a manufacturing requirement which looks at the DMR and the prints, the work instructions for fabricating the product, and those manufacturing requirements then are a satisfaction of the outputs. So when we have a print that says you need to, sterilize the product. Well, the manufacturing department's going to have to decide whether that is the subject, whether it's a verifiable process and it's a subject of a process validation, or you need a process validation to validate that requirement, or whether, say, a supplier is providing that service and you may need to assure that the supplier is properly testing that manufacturing process. So perhaps it's a supplier control or an audit of the supplier. And then, of course, we always have inspection that we can put in, either first articles or receiving inspection or in-process inspection, different kinds of performance-related testing to assure that the manufacturing requirement is verified. So, so that's kind of the manufacturing piece of the flow chart. And of course, now when you overlay the yellow part, which is the risk management, essentially what we have are two work item types, and we're going to talk about those here in a second in detail. But the hazardous situation work item is a container for the hazard, and of course the way we come up and ferret out those hazardous situations is through risk analysis. And two of the most common ways to do that are with the DFMEA, which is the Design Failure Mode Effect Analysis, and then the PFMEA, the Process Failure Mode Effect Analysis. And so you can see that as we identify these hazardous situations, what we're going to do is tie our requirements and design inputs and the manufacturing requirements into the hazardous situations directly as mitigations. So the user need and the product requirements are mitigations to hazards, but also the process failure mode analysis is too. So of course, when you do the DFMEA, we're looking at design components and how those can fail, and then the process, we are looking at the process and how fabrication of the process, the product can fail. So essentially what we want here is a really well-integrated process that uses the requirements that we're going to test for closure. We want to use those requirements directly as mitigations to the hazards. And that way, when we find something in the field, not only can we pretty much any point where you get an audit, if you find a failure, either in your product requirements, in your testing, in your, you have a part fail in the field, or you get a harm to a patient, this will allow you to trace through basically your entire system to determine not only if you've made a mistake in your design, but also if something needs to be mitigated that wasn't contemplated, where to do that quickly and really come up with a terrific strategy for mitigation of this problem, whatever it is in the field. And we can do that really quickly without having to dig through, hundreds of documents to try and figure out what to do about it. So let's go to the next step. So I'll just go back for a sec. So these two work items, the hazardous situation and the risk assessment, those two work items are the subject of quite a bit of discussion in companies. And so I wanted to discuss how those attributes inside the work items work, and one potential way of constructing a system around the regulations that are out there that I think would be helpful to people, because almost every time I do this, risk management really becomes a core question for people to get resolved before they move on. So, so frankly, I find this is one of the most difficult generically to define across different company risk management departments. There's a wide variety of opinions about how to define and relate the elements, surprisingly so, but I've not had any company that I've dealt with really cut that quite the same way. There's quite a bit of room for interpretation in the standards and misunderstanding of how it should be constructed. So obviously I'm not saying that this is the be-all, end-all. It's just, I think, a good pass at it. So let me just sort of run you through the construction. Essentially, we have two work items, the hazardous situation and risk analysis. The hazardous situation is a container for the risk occurrence or the hazard, and the risk analysis is a container for the harm and the harm severity. So hazards are sources, so the standard really 14971 and the 24971, the TR, that the guidance document really talk about these terms in exactly this way. So what I'm trying to do when we construct these things is to do it in a way that the language is recognizable easily to FDA and to ISO. So these terms are taken directly from the standards. So when the FDA, or ISO, I guess it's ISO 14971, talks about a hazard, what they're really talking about are sources. So electromagnetic energy, potential energy, this kind of thing. So the hazard is the source, and then from that hazard comes a foreseeable sequence of events, which in our typical FMEA is really a failure mode. What is it that happens that creates a problem? And then the last piece of it is the hazardous situation. And so I'll give you an example. We have a hazard that's electromagnetic energy. We have a foreseeable sequence of events. For example, you nick a wire. The wire conductor becomes exposed, and then during our assembly process, we push that wire over to the case. So that's the foreseeable sequence of events. And then the hazardous situation is we energize the case. Well, you can imagine that there's lots of different ways to energize a case in a design. So you might have 3 or 4 of these different hazardous situations defined. And, as another example, maybe you pour water on the case, and that creates a short and energizes the case. So in one way or another, we end up with these different situations that could lead to a case being energized. Well, the P1 factor is the probability of that hazardous situation actually occurring. So how likely is it that not only that the wire gets nicked, but then it gets pushed over and actually touches the case and the thing's plugged in all at the same time to create the situation where we have an energized case? That's what the P1 factor is. And then, of course, because we have 2 different or 3 or 4 different hazards, that P1 factor has to be added up. And now, of course, from a statistical standpoint, the worst case is adding up these probabilities. So, if you have a box of balls and you say 50% of the box are orange balls and 50% are balls with dots on them, the worst case is that you never select one with both. But what we're saying here is depending upon what kind of hazard we're talking about, and the 2 hazards, sometimes those populations overlie one another, and you might get an orange ball with a dot on it, if that makes sense. So worst case is really adding these up. So the only way you can do something besides add them up is if you really understand something specifically about the hazard. So in my template, what I do is I add them all up, and that representing a worst case. So once that's done, we've characterized the hazardous situation. Then we go over to the risk analysis and pull that compiled or tabulated P1 factor in as an occurrence compilation. So, okay, now we have an energized case. Somebody touches the case, and then what happens? So what we're saying in the risk analysis is the harm is electrical shock leading to electrocution. So let's just, for example, we say it's a severity of a 5, and we're going to electrocute somebody. Well, not only do we have this probability of does the case become energized, but then if you touch that case, does it electrocute you? And that's what this P2 factor is the probability of the hazardous situation actually leading to the harm, or in this case, electrocution. So we multiply times that factor, and then we end up with a harm occurrence, and that harm occurrence is then multiplied times the harm severity as a scale, which leads to our pre- and post-mitigation risk priority level. And, of course, the risk priority level is what allows us to decide how we're going to mitigate this problem. Is it a high priority mitigation, or is it a low priority mitigation? So this is just to provide you with a template for how is it exactly we're going to process the data associated with the hazards. And then, of course, when we talk about, as in the last print, the hazardous situation, has mitigations against it. So against what we're going to do is we're going to link in those product requirements directly to the hazardous situation, and so everything will be in the same place. We'll know what could happen, and then we'll know precisely what our mitigation strategy is for that stack. So you can imagine that both of these, both the comprehensive traceability table and all the logical relationships and how you construct each one of these work items and how they're interrelated is really important at the beginning of the project, because as you populate these work items, what you're going to be doing is putting data into them, and they're going to be calculating what you need for your regulatory submission, and you really would prefer not to redo those as time goes along. So this is a good step, I think, to provide you with a template, but right at the beginning of the project, I'd sit down and get everybody's feedback, your quality department, your risk management people, all the the product development people, and really get a better sense of whether you believe that this is the right way to go or not. One of the things too, I'm just going to mention this in passing. When I say product requirement, usually there are a great multitude of different types of requirements that people would like, and they call them different things. It might be a mechanical product requirement, an electrical product requirement, or software, and then you break it into different types of software requirements. Lots and lots of different ways that people manage that. And, as long as you aren't, changing them wholesale halfway through the project, I think, just about anything is fine. It's just more a question of, the fewer you have, the easier it is to manage, but there's a lot of good reasons to break those into components. Okay, so now that we have an idea of our project logic, just checking time so I don't run you guys completely into the ground here. The next step is the project document stack, and so there's a variety of documents in a project, and so because we talk quite a bit about logic and how logic is, basically the tool is a logic management tool. We also, in the medical device project, need to talk about how we're going to, where those requirements and those different components are going to live. What documents are they going to live in? One of the real powers of Polarian is that you can create these requirements and all the linking and traceability in documents. So they are actually created in the document and they live in the document. And so it's a super convenient way to push documents out to people and let them review them, and then they can pull them back in, and all that review comes with the document when they pull it back in. But you really want to have a pretty good idea of how you're going to be breaking down your inputs documents. Of course, you need a project plan as a part of regulatory requirement, but your inputs documents are important. You're going to have a systems document probably. If it's a software product, you're going to have an SRS or a software requirement specification and a software design specification and a system architecture document. Likely, some of the people that I've dealt with and a really common way to do this is to break it down by subsystem and roll it up into an overall systems document. Often they're broken down by disciplines. The 62304 requirement really is a different way of doing the development process that's specific to medical device software, so oftentimes people want to break that out separately. So, specifically for, whatever your specific device is, it's likely that you're going to have a slightly different construction from project to project about how you want to manage these inputs documents. And so getting that all squared away pretty early is important too. The product realization plan, I think, is that's one of the documents I use to land a whole bunch of different regulated components. What I put in that document are the quality management plan, so all the inspection steps and how is the quality of the product going to be managed. I put the process list, the overall process list, and then the master validation list, which of course is the definition of all the processes requiring process validation and the justification for why we're doing process validation on some and not on others. Then we have the output list. I dropped the output list in here, which is all the work items that are outputs, which ends up being your device master record. And then other lists related to the manufacturing process. So the nice thing about having a product realization plan, and even a lot of companies break those up into separate documents, but what it essentially does is put everything that's related to the construction of the product in one place, which I kind of like. But, you know, obviously if you have a big company and you're doing, these are all separate departments, sometimes it's much more convenient for the purpose of review to have those documents be separate. So some discussion about that is important. And then, of course, we have risk management and traceability. And this discussion we just had about the risk management work items and how those are going to push up into the plan, the analysis, and the report as required by regulation is important. And I would imagine usually I'll have a discussion with the risk management people at the beginning of the project as to exactly what their expectation is there. So because frankly what we're doing is the engineering department's doing all this work. They're doing 80–90% of the submission. And what we'd really like is when all this work is complete for the risk management and the regulatory submission to be essentially done. So, so we want that input directly early in the process so that as we're creating these deliverables, it populates the submission. Some other things to think about, risk analysis. When I do failure mode and effect analysis, both process and design, what I do is I overlay the work items that we're using that are part of the harms down fault tree analysis with the FMEA. And the reason I do that is so that the FMEA populates into the hazardous situation work item directly. And that way, as the engineering departments are doing these failure mode analyses, and they're filling out all these potential risks, what they're actually doing is stacking up the hazardous situations for the risk analysis people to tie to the user harm. And that just makes this whole process of doing risk analysis a whole lot easier. That way, the risk analysis people don't have to pull in variables called, local effects or system effects and try to figure out what that means to users. What you're just saying is do the risk analysis with an FMEA and provide all the hazardous situations that could occur in the product or in the processes. And then the risk analysis people simply have to link them to the risk analysis work items that are applicable, and then all the calculation for the RPLs and the harms and the harm severities happens automatically. And so it really saves a lot of time if we don't have to sit there and take those FMEAs and reprocess them into the overall risk management file. So I'd highly recommend a process for saying, we believe in this case the local effect is the hazardous situation. We're going to define it as that, and we're going to process the file in that way. So just something to think about, because it really saves a lot of work on the back end if those, when we do the analysis, it drives directly into the risk management or risk analysis. And then, of course, regulatory. Depending on which markets you're going to go into, just a couple examples, but technical file for EU or 510K US shown for Japan. What's a really convenient thing to do is to create a document inside of Plarion and put your template for the technical file. So say it's a class 2 device and you're going to do a technical file. You have a pretty good sense right from the beginning of what's going to be required for that technical file once you get done with your regulatory strategy. Same thing for the 510K. Well, if you pull those major categories in and the requirements in, not a requirement particularly, but that's probably the wrong word, but to delineate what the needs of the 510K are, and then take all the output that we're developing as part of this design control file, and we can copy them in directly. So what's going to happen is, as you're building your design control, you're going to be populating your 510K. And of course, the really great thing about that is it pushes regulatory into the development of that file very early in the process. And because of that, what we end up with is no lack of understanding of the expectations of the regulatory people late in the project, where they get all the engineering work and then they say, well, you constructed this product requirements document improperly. Well, if the product requirements document is line 30 in the 510K and they're responsible for reviewing this as we go along, you don't get any surprises like that. So I really would recommend some thought about how the regulatory file and how we're going to process that as part of the project. And then of course we have other sort of ancillary things that are a lot of people don't think about but are really great leverage points for Polarian. One of them is and I get this question a lot, the standards. What do we do with standards? Well, if we're going to have ISO standards and company SOPs and ASTM testing standards, all these different types of standards out there, how is it that we're going to process those into requirements? Well, what you really would like to do is pull the standards in directly and open those standards in as a file in Polarian and break them down as sources and then link them to the product requirement that we have in the file. So it's really a kind of a cool setup. So what you end up with is, you might have 5 documents that talk about sterility. You might have a shipping document, you might have a product-specific document, an internal SOP, and they all say that the product has to be sterilized. Well, they're all stated in sort of slightly different ways, and so are you going to pull in 4 requirements from these different standards directly into your design file and then have 4 things you have to tie out? Or do you create a link between those standards or sources of the requirement and then create your own product requirement that processes those 4 standards in a way that is appropriate for your device? And that way, the link is direct, but the thing you're standing on is one well-defined requirement. They don't step on each other. It's all been processed, and it's a really slick way to kind of resolve conflicts of standards, because sometimes one will say one thing and something else will say something different. I had one example of that. I did a catheter a while back, and the requirement for testing in the EU is different than the requirement for testing in the U.S., and gosh, it's kind of nice to have both of those as standards sources, and then we pull them over to the requirement, and then when you don't understand why a requirement's written the way it is, having the source right there is really a super convenient way to do it. Then, of course, some other things, just food for thought, are standard text fields. So when you do your indication for use, you want that to be a very standard set of language that's approved by regulatory and never changing and the same everywhere throughout the project. And sometimes these things are a paragraph long, and you don't want even a word being improperly typed in the 15 places that it's supposed to go. So you create a text field work item and type that text in, approve it, and then you can copy it throughout the project. And that does a couple different things, and same thing with the standards, but when you copy the requirement over to the documents, it does 2 things. If you want to change it, it changes it everywhere at the same time. So you change the source, and then the copies change, so you get perfect compliance throughout your file. Second thing is, if you want to make a change, you also know what documents that it's in. So let's say in the case of a standard that you've copied over, you're saying I'm referencing the 2006 standard, and you want to know which documents I reference that standard in. Well, you click on the link and it gives you the documents that it's residing in, where it was copied to. It's really kind of a nice feature. Then, of course, the glossary. One of my pet peeves is, in all these files we have glossaries, and sometimes you have 100 test documents and the glossary is slightly different from document to document. Well, how much better then to create a glossary work item, and you define it once, and then it's copied throughout the file, and then you have nice, clean consistency on the glossary throughout the file. So just a few things that are kind of fun ways to really leverage the tool in a way that might not be totally obvious to people when you first start using the tool. So again, I'll just hit on this again. Really what we're doing here is we're building regulatory submissions. And so I would really encourage some thought about how is it we're going to use this file in such a way that it builds to the submission. You know, we're not trying to just do an exercise in tying out tests to requirements. What we're trying to do is complete a submission. We're trying to get this document sold in the market. And this is just a fantastic tool. If you think of it in a more global sense and you say, you know, really what I'm looking for here is predictability in my submission process. I want to say that when we do our submission, we have the absolute best chance we can possibly have that everything that we have contemplated in this product, not only have we thoroughly processed the file, but we've also come in and tested it and assured that all the testing was done properly. Everything's been tied out. And that's going to improve our predictability of our submission. And so we want all this data to just build straight up into the submission. And so I'd encourage some thought about that, because kind of a global idea of how we're managing these products and how we're building the submissions, I think, is important. And then finally, the last thing is just I always stop and have some discussion about external system interfaces. So one logical place, and probably the best place to interface with external systems. A lot of people are running PLM systems. Some of them, you know, Teamcenter at Siemens Teamcenter is one. I see Agile out there a lot. Arena Solutions is one that I'm familiar with. Essentially what they are quality management and product management solutions. So they carry the company's documents in a ECO released environment. And if you're not going to be changing that, if that's going to be your repository and where the FDA and the ISO are going to hit your system, then I would probably suggest that what you would like is the work item that is the output to have a part number that's associated with it. That's the same part number that you use in Arena or in Agile. And that way you'd have a direct interface to those systems. If you choose to, you can either do it, integrated on the back end, or just a number, so you know where to go to get this file that you're discussing. And so there's a link there. But I typically do that in the design output work item. But some thought about these external systems and how they are going to interface with Polarion, I think, is important. So I think that probably gets me to a point where we've discussed just about everything I can think of anyway in an initial implementation of a file. So I appreciate your time, and if you have any questions at this point, I'd be interested in seeing if I can answer them. So.
Okay, thanks very much, Lawrence. As I mentioned at the very beginning, for attendees, if you do have any questions that you'd like to ask immediately, please use our Q&A panel. So there's actually a Q&A panel. If you use that, we will take your questions and pose them to Larry, and hopefully we have time to answer it. So we have a couple of minutes. There are a couple of questions already, so I've taken those and filtered them. First one for you is, how do you handle essential requirements?
Okay, so essential requirements are one of the things that we use in the technical file. So, and I think the reason that countries do this is because they want to process the data in a particular way that's the same for all the devices. So they're really they're requirements in a way, but what they're asking for is particular pieces of the design control data. And so what I do is I create a work item called a essential requirement work item, and then what I do is I link the proofs that are created in the design control file back to the essential requirements. So when we create that essential, the essential requirements document, that it draws in all of the design elements that are associated with each of those in particular. And so, I think we can do a really nice job of, in the same way as creating the, I'm just maximizing my screen here. You probably don't want to look at my airplane in the background, but in the same way that we create the 510K and we pull those design elements in, really what the essential requirements list is a resort of the document of the data in a different way. And so we can have the discussion in that essential requirements document for each one as to how we've contemplated it in the design and then provide the proof directly. So it's really kind of a slick way to generate the documents, just sort of a subset of the technical file.
Okay, great. Next question. Do you have a copy of 601 as a template in Polarian?
601, 62304, or what? I'm not sure what 601 is. A copy of 601.
Okay, well, yeah, we'll get hopefully some clarification from the attendee.
Yeah. Sorry about that.
So wait for that. There are some other questions here.
Let me, and I'll try to answer that too. As a matter of course,
60601.
Oh, 60601. No, I don't, but I've done a bunch of them. So whenever I run into one, I'm pretty much drawing them in now. So I've done about half of the biocompatibility documents. I have 62304 in there, 5840. So as I'm using them, I'm pulling them in. But that particular one I haven't. But I just started a project here not too long ago, and I'm gonna be having to do that one. So so not yet, but it's coming.
Okay, great. Is to let the attendees know as well is that if it's a free template, we publish them actually on the Polarian website underneath extensions, as well as there are paid templates as well. So certainly don't hesitate to go to the website and check to see what's available. Even if it's paid, we'll let you know if it is available. Some other questions here. So there's certain.
Hang on a second. Let me throw something else in. If it's an ISO standard, of course, those are copyrighted. So, any processing we do of ISO documents, you'd have to purchase the standard directly anyway. So, just so you know, we're, obviously there's not going to be an ISO standard up on the extensions website because it's a copyrighted thing. Just for clarification.
Right. What was the tool validation effort to implement Polarian for design control, risk management functionalities?
Well, so I'm a little bit of a different case in that I started completely from scratch. So I, the effort required to do that is I probably took a couple months. And so let me just be clear. This is not a question about Polarian and how hard it is to implement something in Polarian. This is a question that's related to, do you know exactly what you want to do in a design control? And so for me, what it was is a scouring of regulations, our internal SOPs, and then I've gone through about 3 different iterations to fully understand what exactly I wanted Polarian to do. And so, this might be more of a question about what's my process for implementing a process than it is a Polarian. If I knew exactly what I wanted to do, Polarian would have accomplished it probably. We could probably got the template together in a couple days. But the problem that I've had is, I tweak things as I go, and hopefully that those tweaks make it better and more compliant with regulatory requirements. So I'm really trying to improve this template as I go. And you can imagine there's a lot of room for different interpretation of what the standards want you to do. And so you got to kind of come to your own understanding of what you believe the right way to do it is. So.
Okay, so here's something more from your opinion, Larry. ISO standards can have clauses that prevent reproduction or storage on a network's location. Do you have any comments on whether importing a standard into Polarian as a template is violating these clauses?
So I think it's a very good question. So you purchase the standard for the purpose of tearing it up into requirements and using those in your project. All right, that's the whole purpose of purchasing a standard in the first place. So if the purpose of this is to replicate it for use on the network, that's one thing. If the purpose of it is to provide those requirements to your requirements system, in order to properly process those requirements into your product control, I would say no. I think it's fine. And because we do that every day, right? Just because you're reading the document and typing it in doesn't mean that you're not using the language directly. I mean, the whole purpose is to use the language directly. But if the idea is we want to provide everyone access to the ISO document, that's something different. So, you're going to have to come to your own conclusion. But, the whole purpose of the ISO document is to provide us with the language required by law. So.
Okay, great. We have time for another question or two. How do you, or is it possible to actually have a hierarchy of requirements in Polarion?
Oh, yeah. So that's a great question. There's no question that it is possible. And so, but I think one of the troubles you run into is that a requirement is defined as a product need that is testable, that it has its acceptance criteria as part of the definition of the requirement. And when you start nesting product requirements, what ends up happening is you partially define your requirement, and the requirement is only fully defined in the context of other requirements that are linked to it. So we can nest those requirements, but then the question really comes, when we're verifying the requirement, the top level, what are we verifying? Because it's incomplete without the components on the bottom, and frankly, the components on the bottom are incomplete without the top. So I think from a development of your test protocol strategy, it makes a lot more sense to make those requirements independent and to stand on their own, to be isolated and contain everything in them that you need to do the test. So generally, I kind of heavily encourage people to make their requirements self-contained. There is, of course, the idea of a user need, and the user need, by definition, is something that we're going to verify or validate. So there's more flexibility in that term, and so probably what I'd recommend is thinking about different constructions than kind of quote-unquote requirements. Requirements should be self-contained, in my opinion. But you can do it.
Okay,
I mean,
great.
Polarion sure lets you do it. If you want to define something as a requirement and then have a nest 12 deep, you can sure do that. I think it'd create problems for you, but it's possible.
Are we planning on complying with 21 CFR Part 11?
Well, so Part 11 compliance is, Polarion is provides everything that you need to be Part 11 compliant. And so I think the question with Part 11 compliance has more to do with what are you trying to accomplish in the tool, and do you even want to bother with it, right? So I think that requires the tool provides you with everything you need to be Part 11 compliant if you so desire it. I think is probably the short answer.
And related to this question, you've kind of answered it, but are you planning to comply with the FDA software validation requirements in general?
I think that really depends on your intended use of Polarion. And so depending on how people implement the tool, sometimes what they'll do is they'll say, look, we currently use whatever Agile as our face to the FDA. So when the FDA comes in or ISO auditor comes in, they ask for a document. We pull it out of our Agile system as a controlled release document, and we slide it over the table. They evaluate the document, and that's how our regulatory process works. In that case, you're not accessing Polarion directly in the overall system. You're basically using Polarion as a tool to generate a very sophisticated tool, albeit, but a tool to generate these product requirements documents and the traceability tables. And then you're exporting those documents to your Agile system, and when you then, or Team Center or whatever, then when you go to approve them, what you're doing is you're verifying those documents before you put them into the system. And so what that does is it abstracts Polarion from this whole question of software validation. So just depending on how you implement the tool and what your intended use of the tool. Now, the other way to implement Polarion, which, I think there's a really good argument to be made that companies ought to do it this way. But if you want to implement Polarion fully with the manufacturing piece in the traceability table engaged. And then what you could do is put your receiving and inspection in there and actually drive the testing on the production floor directly through Polarion. Okay, now we're talking about, we're in the middle of the construction of the product, and our intended use of Polarion is to control the use of and the building of the product. Now it's a subject of process validation. We're going to have to think about process validation. So I think it really depends. So the validation, if you do a validation, it could be very simple or it could be really complicated. So it just depends on what you're using it for.
Okay, so I want to thank you very much, Larry, and thank you for everybody for attending. Have a great day and have a great weekend.
Appreciate the time.